welcome everybody to our monthly seminar. Yes, we start right now. So like I said, hello, good morning. Welcome everybody to our monthly seminar. I'm Frederic, Director of the Institute of Aquatic Ecology. For the ones who attend the seminar for the first time, we are a research institute focused on the study of aquatic ecology, covering from freshwater environments to the marine environment. The institute is organized in three sections. Section working on streams, rivers, freshwaters, wetlands, covering from microinvertebrates to fish species. A section which is working on microbial ecology, and section working on the marine environment. Today we have a seminar which is far from our research field, but we like to expand our interests to different topics. So we move to endangered bird species. So our speaker is Jaume Badia-Boher. She's a PhD student at the University of Barcelona, working on endangered bird species. Good morning, Jaume.
Good morning, nice to meet you.
And he will talk about endangered bird species. He has been working as well on other endangered animal species. So please welcome, and I hope the seminar will be interesting for everyone. And at the end of the seminar, we will have space for some questions and comments. So thank you very much.
Hello, hope you can hear me well. Yes, Frederic?
Yes.
Yes, cool, great. I'm gonna share my screen. We tried before and it worked. Hopefully it's gonna work again. So I hope you can see it properly, and I also hope you can see it when I change slides. I'll check the chat if you guys can give me some feedback. Cool, great. So thank you very much for having me here in this seminar. It's for me, wait a second, because we said we had to switch the camera off as well for the chat. Okay, thank you very much for having me here. It's been quite hard to do this seminar. We intended to do it on March 2020, more or less. And as you all remember, on March 2020, we were on a lockdown, unfortunately, because of the coronavirus. So we got some delays, but in the end, we could appoint it in September. And here I am, and I'm super happy and super grateful to Frederic, Hector, and the University of Girona, the Institute of Aquatic Ecology, to give me this opportunity. We're not going to talk about aquatic ecology today. We're going to talk about birds. But I hope that you enjoy it. Because of the format of the presentation, we cannot answer questions throughout the presentation, but whenever we're finished, we will accept questions in English and also in Catalan and Spanish, and if you have them. So let's move on. So as Frederic said, my name is Jaume. I am a PhD candidate in biodiversity in the University of Barcelona. Today's seminar is going to be focused on an evaluation of conservation measures on an endangered bird. We have published we published an article about that, and the seminar is going to be around this article. I'll tell you a little bit slides on. I'll make first a small introduction about myself. Here you have my social media and email if you want to get in contact with me at some point. I will be happy to read you. Well, I did my degree in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, finished in 2015. And yeah, when I finished my degree, I did not have it clear which career path I wanted to do. There's lots of people that finish the career and they have it super clear. They want to work on research. It's not my case. So when I finished, I worked as a technician at the Institute of Evolutionary Biology here in Barcelona for some months. It was quite nice, and I left to Sweden, to the University of Lund, to do my master's in ecology. Super interesting, super nice experience, very recommended. And there I got the opportunity to get a training contract in the red list of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which actually was a very good experience as well. I worked with mollusks, so you see I changed from mollusks to birds. That was a good change, but yeah, it was also quite interesting. We basically had to assess the conservation status of European mollusks and add them to the red list. But when I finished with that experience, I went to try with research, and at the University of Lund, I got a collaboration with 2 Spanish institutions of research to work with the Canarian Egyptian Vulture, which is this guy on the left. So my master's thesis was about them, and actually this seminar is going to be about this species. When I completed my master's thesis, I moved to the University of Barcelona. I started my PhD in June 2020, and yeah, I am working with the Bonellis eagle. You might know it, those that are Catalan or Spanish, with the name of Aliga cuabarrada or Aliga pertiquera, or in Spanish, Águila o azor perticera. But with both species, I have been working mainly on my main research interests, which are basically raptor and conservation, and I like to answer questions about ecology and conservation of raptors using quantitative methods, for example, mark-recapture ones, which are the ones I'm focused on. And also now in my PhD, I'm introducing to the world of Bayesian analysis. I don't know if you guys are familiarized with Bayesian analysis, but basically it is a statistical philosophy that's booming in the world of ecology. And yeah, probably the future, we're going to have a lot of Bayesian analysis. And one of the aims of my PhD is to introduce this Bayesian analysis on the mark-recapture methods. And I recommend everybody to give it a check because it's very interesting. With not a big amount of data, you can answer very complex questions. So it's big opportunity in the field of ecology where normally we don't have such big amounts of data. So after having introduced myself, let's start with the seminar, with the core of the seminar, the introduction, actually. And first, I would like to put you in the context of why we did the article and why we did the work that we did, because we wanted, as I said, to answer whether some conservation measures were effective to recover an endangered bird. And we think that this is very important. To give you a little bit of context, I guess that you are all familiarized with the critical situation that biodiversity is undergoing right now. If you see this graph over here, the extinction rate, which is the green line, is speeding up at an exponential way. It is quite correlated with the human population increase as well, as you can see. But what is not increasing exponentially, unfortunately, is the economic resources available for conservation, which I don't expect them to increase that much in the future either. And we have a third problem here in the conservation crisis, which is that if we analyze how conservation is going, we can say that many conservation actions don't reach the target. So let's say that conservation actions have a low effectiveness. And that's a problem, actually, because I don't expect the extinction rate to stop increasing in the near future. And if we have low economic resources and we have lots of extinctions, and at the same time we have low effectiveness, that's a challenge. That's a challenge because the only way to have a better response to the extinction crisis is to increase the effectiveness of conservation actions. This is easy to say, but difficult to do, right? But there was another field of science that was the same problems not for 6 decades ago in the 1960s, and this is actually medicine. There's quite a lot of scientists that work in conservation that say that we perhaps should inspire to change conservation and how it's conceived. We should inspire on what medicine did in the 1960s. So to give you an idea of the problem, in the 1960s, medicine was not that much related to science, but rather to experience, which is called. For example, when you had a problem or when you had an injury or an illness, evidence, which is actually trying to summarize and to compile all studies that try to provide information about the effectiveness of specific conservation actions, so that managers and conservationists can use it as a reference to choose to make decisions about their management systems. The bubble system that we used in medicine can be conceived as something very similar to the one in conservation. For example, we have to consider, to build up evidence-based conservation, we have to consider these values, which is the target of our conservation measure. On the other hand, we also have to consider the experience and local knowledge of the conservationists and managers, which is also very important. And the third pillar of that is, again, evidence, which is what science says is effective and what science says is not effective. But we have a problem here, which is that it's not that easy in ecology to do randomized trials or clinical assessments, right? And also, our way of working in conservation for the last years is to provide, for example, funding for a conservation action. And once we implement the conservation action, funding stops. And there is no monitoring program that monitors what happens to the target of the conservation action. For example, if we want to implement a conservation action on a plant that is disappearing, implement this conservation action, to know if our conservation actions were effective or not, we should monitor the status of that plant in the short, mid, and possibly in the long term as well, to see if the actions worked out. Many studies and many conservation plans not consider this long-term monitoring plan, so in the end, we have a huge lack of evidence in conservation. So it is very difficult to build up conservation evidence and evidence-based conservation. And because of this, we did the article that we wanted to do, because, as I said before, we assess the effectiveness of different conservation measures to see if they help a critically endangered population to recover. And with this, we want to provide scientific evidence useful to other conservation projects and managers to say, okay, if we try the same conservation measures that have improved effective in another study, perhaps it's going to work in my study as well. And that's a good background for other managers to base their knowledge as well. So let's move on to the exact things we did in this study. So we focused on vultures. When we talk about critically endangered populations, vultures, they have a very bad conservation status. So they are usually the target of many conservation actions. This is not by luck. There's many different features of the biology of vultures that make them very prone to extinction and to being endangered. The first of them is that they are long-lived species. So there's been reports of vultures living more than 40 years. That's quite a lot for a wild species. But also, besides of that, there is that they have delayed maturity, which means that they don't get sexually active or sexually mature on the first year of life. Normally, you have to wait for some years for them to get sexually mature. It is being sexually mature in your second year of age for a vulture is quite early. And for some species, you have to wait even to the 4th, 5th, 6th, or even 7th, 8th year of life. That's quite a lot of a wait. And then when they become sexually mature, they have low clutch sizes. It means that they basically lay from 1 to 3 eggs a year, and they raise from 0 to 2 chicks a year, more or less, which is not a lot, right? And if you have, for example, a population that is endangered and is close to extinction and you want it to recover, they will not recover fast. They will recover slowly because of these biological features. So in that point in which there are very few pairs of the vulture and you will make them recover, and there's, for example, 6 or 7 pairs, that's a critical moment for the vulture, and when you want it to recover, it's going to be quite slow. So reintroduction actions or conservation actions will need to be intense and continue through time to achieve the recovery of vultures. Let's go to put into context the conservation status of vultures, because perhaps people cannot understand the dramatic moment that we are living with vultures. Let's compare them, for example, to albatrosses and petrels. Albatrosses are very popular, actually, species, and many people know that they are endangered. They are nice, they are big, they have very interesting biology features. But if we, for example, compare them in this graph, and this graph shows an index created by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to reflect the conservation status of different animal groups, you can see that although albatrosses have a bad conservation status, it has more or less maintained at a constant level for the last 40 years. Instead, vultures, in the 1988, for example, they were a little bit better, but in the last years, they have undergone dramatic declines. So right now, they're in a critical situation. And that's another thing we could talk about, but perhaps it wouldn't be 100% the focus of the seminar, but you can definitely ask me later about that vultures have a very specific role in the ecosystems, and it's difficultly replaceable by other species. It is a role that's very important, actually, in the ecosystems, but also for our human health and human economy. So if vultures disappear, that's not going to be good for us, and that's going to be good for the ecosystems either. So we are in a critical situation, as I said. So that's the species we're going to work with in this seminar. This is the Canarian Egyptian vulture. The Egyptian vulture, although the name says it's Egyptian, actually it's not found in Egypt right now. Quite curious, right? And if you see the distribution map in the upper right corner, you can see that it is distributed in Africa, Europe, Asia, and also there is a subspecies, which is the Canarian Egyptian vulture, that is only found in the Canary Islands. And this is the one we're going to focus with in this seminar. If you see, for example, the distribution map, in the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, it was widespread in all the 7 islands of the Canary Islands. And especially in the 1950s, 1960s, it started disappearing at a very quick rate, to the extent that now it's only found in the easternmost islands of the archipelago, which are Fuerteventura and Lanzarote, as you can see here in this map. In 1998, there were only 21 breeding pairs left. This is not a big population size, it's quite low, and the IUCN declared it as critically endangered, which is the last step before getting extinct. This was actually a critical situation, which started attracting the attention of institutions and scientists, which decided in 1998 to start a monitoring program in the island to try to understand what was happening to that subspecies, to that population. So they started trying to ring as many individuals as possible with alphanumeric rings, which are basically, you have probably seen them at some point, which are rings that are attached to the legs of birds, in this case vultures, and they have an alphanumeric code. So every single vulture has a different code, and you can differentiate vultures from each another and follow the life of every vulture individually. So this is why ringing and using marks is so important in the field of ecology. These field biologists working in Fuerteventura would also aim at trying to see and to observe what vultures were doing, if possible, every vulture following the marks every year, to see, for example, if vultures were mating or if they died, unfortunately, every year. So they wanted to have a complete registry of vulture activities through time. But also there was a huge effort to find dead vultures as well. They found 63 of them, which is quite a lot. And when they found any dead vultures, what they would do is to make autopsies to try to find out the reason of their death. And by doing this, they did having some data about what was happening to the population. One of the things they found out that was happening in the population was that they were having many issues with power lines, and most of them were dying in power lines, actually. What's the relationship between vultures and power lines in the island of Fuerteventura? This is something I have not explained, but it's very interesting. If you check in this picture in the left, you will see that Fuerteventura is basically a desert. If you see in the map, in a world map, you will see that it's just 90 kilometers away from the colony of Western Sahara. Western Sahara is basically a Saharan region, and we would say probably that Fuerteventura is just an extension of Sahara, more or less, with, as you can see in the picture, no trees, almost no shrubs either, and no grass. So let's say that the only high points in the island are power lines. And these vultures love being in high positions, because in high positions they can control the environment, they can stay away from possible predators, and they can look for carcasses and sleep in a safe position. So in the islands of Fuerteventura and Lanzarote, Egyptian vultures have a strong relationship with power lines, right? and this makes them be exposed to these threats I'm going to introduce you right now. The first common way of dying, unfortunately, in power lines is by being attached by the leg to the stabilizers of the power line. You can see here in the right the power cable and this circular structure in red, which is a stabilizer that controls the static electricity so that it doesn't away from the power line. The problem is that when vultures get attached to this stabilizer, they cannot get rid of it, and unfortunately they die there. But sadly, there's other ways to die in these power lines. Another one is collisions. This is very common as well in other birds. As you know, and even if it sounds weird for the human eye, for the eye of birds and especially vultures, it's sometimes difficult to detect a power line when you're flying, and it's quite easy actually to crash with them, so that when they crash with them, normally they get injuries in the shoulder, and these injuries make them die. And the other way of dying in the power lines is by electrocutions, although that was quite a rare way of dying, at least in the beginning of the study. But also scientists found out that there was another threat to vultures in the island, and that was the threat of poisoning. As you may know, vultures are scavengers. They feed on dead bodies, and some of these dead bodies in the island of Fuerteventura, unfortunately, are poisoned. Normally, farmers or other people in the island would, for example, use a dead goat and fill it with poisoned baits, so that when the local fauna eat them. Hi, again. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Well, that was a good moment to relax a little bit, and let's go for it again. Guys, let's hope you're feeling this is interesting so far. I hope you can hear me well again. Let me disconnect my camera. Cool, great. Let's move on. So I was talking about poisoning, right? I don't know where you stopped hearing me. I will start again the poisoning thing, so I make sure that everybody understands it. Basically, another threat that scientists detected in the island of Fuerteventura was that many vultures were dying because of poisoning. And the reason for that was that in Fuerteventura, especially farmers, but also other people, would bait dead animals, especially goats, with poison to kill the local fauna. And you have to think that vultures, especially vultures, and especially almost every species of vulture, is very, very sensible to poison. So with small quantities of poison, they can die very rapidly. And that's actually bad news for Egyptian vultures. There's a curious thing here in the island, that if you think about most of Europe, people have a misconception about vultures, but it's not like this in Fuerteventura, actually, in which people, I would say they love vultures. They don't have a misconception of them, but they rather hate other species, for example, feral dogs or ravens. And when they bait goats and they bait dead animals, the intention is to kill dogs and ravens. They don't want to kill the vultures. Of course, vultures don't know about that, and when they eat these dead bodies, they end up dying as a result as well. So now we knew what was happening to the population. We knew that the main threats were power line accidents and poisoning, so that what institutions and researchers did was to contact and to apply for funding to the Life Nature Project, which is one of the most common conservation funding actions or funds in the European Union. And they got a nice funding from 2004 to 2008 to do a conservation program to try to stop the decrease of the Egyptian vulture and try to recover it. And this Life Nature project had basically 2 blocks. The first block was to try to modify power lines to make them vulture safe, and they would do 2 things here. For example, the one was to use anti-collision systems, and this is basically the mechanism here, is that these systems are easy to see by the vultures, so they can easily avoid then the power cables. So they wanted to stop collisions from happening. And the other thing was to change the stabilizers with these anti-entanglement wires that, if you compare them to the old ones, these are much more wide, and because they are wider, birds would not get attached by the leg to these stabilizers. But they had also another aim with this live project, which was to undertake some awareness and education campaigns to spread and to make population know about the problematics that was going on with poisoning, actually. So they would like to increase the media presence of the problematics and of the vulture disappearance in the islands, and also try to communicate these problems to stakeholders, which were basically farmers and kids in schools. So this is a diagram that will make you probably understand the timings of the conservation action and of our study. In 1998, the monitoring started, and we have data until 2017. Between 2004 and 2008, we implemented the conservation measures, but they were mainly, most of them implemented between 2005 and 2006. So we divided our study, our scenario, in 2 different scenarios, let's say. The one was the before the implementation of the conservation actions until 2006, and there was the second scenario was the after, which was between 2007 and 2017, which is after the implementation of the conservation actions. And between these 2 scenarios, we would compare whether the population had recovered as a result of the conservation measures. One of the things we did was to estimate a demographic parameter that's very important to study the population viability, especially of species like the vultures, which is survival. And we wanted to know if survival had improved. And the second thing that we wanted to do is to see if the mortality causes had been mitigated. So we wanted to see if vultures were dying less or were not dying anymore of the mortality causes that have been exposed in the power lines and in poisoning. So that was basically the aim of our study. And one thing maybe has come into your mind here. Why should we need to estimate survival? I mean, wouldn't it be easier to go to the field and try to count the individuals year by year and try to say, oh, this year there's more individuals than last year, so probably the conservation measures are working. I would not do this from my side, because probably, for example, if on year 1 you go to the field and count the number of vultures, and on year 2 you go to the field and count the number of vultures, and for example, you don't put the same effort on the year 1 and then on the year 2, and for example, you find less vultures on year 2 than year 1, you don't know why. Perhaps it is because the population is decreasing. Perhaps it is because we didn't put the same effort on both. So we need a method that allows us to account for this, let's say, surveying effort, and gives us robust estimates of demographic parameters that are not biased. And estimating survival is what allows us to do this, basically. And also, there's another good thing here, that is that there are powerful methods to estimate survival. Survival is a demographic parameter that's being estimated in many populations. It's very easy to compare between populations, and there's a lot of knowledge about it. So it's, I'd say, the perfect estimate to estimate here, actually. And the powerful methods that are being developed and have seen recent improvements and developments in the last decades are the capture mark-recapture methods, which are the methods in which this study is focused. And I will introduce them very briefly in the next slides. But there is a challenge in estimating survival in long-life species like our Egyptian vultures. The first challenge is that survival normally shows age differences. What do we mean with that? When we talk about long-life species, birds and mammals, we are talking about complex species. Complex species that have to learn about skills and change behaviors throughout their lives. And this makes survival to change along age. For example, when an individual is born, their flying abilities are not that well developed. And we could expect, for example, if they don't fly that well, that they might have more problems in power lines. That would be a legit thing to assume, for example. And we might expect, for example, mortality in power lines to be stronger in juveniles. On the other hand, juveniles, when they eat, they go to what is called the supplementary feeding stations, which are feeding stations in the island that provide safe food. When I say safe, I mean poison-free food. And juveniles normally go there to feed. But so we could expect that juveniles don't have that many problems with poisoning, right? But for example, adults, they have a completely different behavior. They fly super well, so probably they will not have many problems in power lines. But on the other hand, because most of them live in territories, and they live in territories with their couples, and they breed together, and they don't like to leave their territories to feed, they might not have like long journeys to go to eat to supplementary feeding stations, but they will probably base their diet in the food that they find within their territories. And if this food is from a farm, they might be eating food that is exposed to poison. So perhaps we might expect adults, for example, that are more prone to being poisoned, and juveniles that are more prone to have problems with power lines. So depending on the magnitude of the different threats, we can find different survival in different age classes. And this is why it is super important to estimate survival for every age class. There is also another thing that we have to consider in long life species, for example, the Egyptian vulture, which is that there's many studies that show that for a population to be self-sustainable, it is much more important to have a high adult survival than to have a high juvenile survival. So it's not the same for a population. When an adult dies, the effect for the population is much stronger than when a juvenile dies. So, for example, there is a rule of thumb that says that if adult survival is not above 0.90 in a population, the population is probably decreasing, while juvenile survival can easily be below 0.9 and the population might still be self-sustainable. So yeah, this is why we estimate survival for every age class. I didn't say that, but survival is basically a parameter that tells you which percentage of individuals is surviving every year and which one is dying. And we based our age differences in 3 age classes. One is juveniles, 1-year-olds, the other one is subadults, and the other one is adults. And with this separation, we aimed at capturing the differences in behavior in the most effective way. So, wait a second. I tried to be didactic with this slide, so you can. I don't know if you guys are familiarized with capture mark-recapture methods, but when I say about estimating survival, a very important thing is that we get robust estimates that reflect reality, right? So to do that, we have to have a good experimental design, and we have to work with these mark-recapture methods, which I'll tell you about how they work. When we try to estimate survival or another parameter in an ecological wild population, there are many sources of uncertainty, actually, and we have to account for them when estimating survival. How does this work? If you see this line of numbers below the pictures, this is classically a row in a capture mark-recapture study, in which every row is an individual, and in this individual, every number is a year. So basically here that ones and zeros, the first one is the first year of the study, the first 0 is the second year of the study, then there's the third, the fourth, and so on. And the number 1 means that the individual has been observed for a specific year. The number 0 means that the individual hasn't been observed. So for example, imagine in the beginning of the study, that's a number 1, so it means that we have seen the individual. Then there's a number 0, it means that we haven't seen the individual. And then there's another number 0, which means that we haven't seen the individual again. Remember that we can see every individual and distinguish every individual from each other because we have tags on the individuals. We have these rings, as you can see here in the right. There is this guy with the yellow mark in the leg with a number that's 208, so we can identify these individuals throughout their lives. And at some point, when we get to the 3rd year, and on the 3rd year we haven't seen it, imagine that, for example, you still don't have what's going to happen in the 4th year, right? So in the 3rd year, you can say, oh, I mean, we haven't seen the individual for the last 2 years. What has happened to the individual? Is it alive, and we haven't seen it by chance? Or is it already dead? We don't know it, actually. We have no clue. But then comes the 4th year, and on the 4th year there's a 1, so it means we have seen it again. So this means that actually in the 2nd and 3rd year, the individual was alive, but we failed to see it. This is the way that mark-recapture models estimate detection probability and estimate detection failure, which is the probability of missing the individual for a specific year. And this is an excellent proxy of detection effort or sampling effort. So we can correct for this in our estimates. And let's move to the last part of the study, because here in this individual in particular, we saw it 4 years before the end of the study, and on the 3 last years of the study, we didn't see it anymore. So we end the study with 3 zeros, 3 years without seeing it, and we have actually no clue of what happened. Was it that the individual died? Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, so you lost the audio again? No, okay, sorry. Let's move on. So we had these 3 last years of the study. We haven't seen the individual. We have no clue about what happened because we completed the study. We're not going to go to the field anymore. So the capture mark recapture method will help us allocate this sort of uncertainty about what happened to the individual, and our estimates will reflect this uncertainty. But there's actually another cause that might explain why we're not seeing the individual, which is tag loss. As I said, individuals have these rings on the legs, so we can see them individually. And what happens if this ring breaks, for example, or if it gets degraded and you cannot read the numbers anymore? It's not that the individual died. It's basically that you're not going to be able to see it anymore in the study because it doesn't have the ring that made it possible to identify it, actually. So we should also account for this in our mark recapture study. And what we did to account for that is basically mark them with 2 rings at the same time. For example, this picture in the right, it shows this plastic ring with an alphanumeric code, and this picture in the left, the individual has a metal ring. We would ring them with both rings at the same time. Basically, when they lose one of the rings, they still have the other one, so that we can estimate this ring loss. And this way, we could assemble a mark recapture model that's called multievent, in which we could get these estimates of survival that were actually accounting for uncertainty, so they were robust. We are confident that they were reflecting reality in a very good way. This is also very important when you do mark recapture models. You should not trust your numbers because you clicked a button and the mark recapture model estimated an estimate or a demographic parameter. You should always think which are the sources of uncertainty and try to account for them. So let's go straight to the results. But of course, as I said, this is the general frame of our model. We are basically interested in estimating survival of different age classes. But as I said, to estimate good survival, we have to account for this uncertainty. So basically, the model is also accounting for this detection probability, which is called recite, of the different marks that were there in the study, which were basically the plastic and the metal ones. And we also tried to estimate, as I said, this recite probability was a very good proxy of sampling effort. And we also had the recovery probability, which was basically the probability of finding a dead individual in the field, so that when we found a dead individual with a tag, we could tell the model, hey, this individual is dead for sure. We're not going to be able to see it anymore because it's dead. So treat the uncertainty as it is here. We know for certainty that the individual is dead. And there was another thing that we estimated, as I said, which was tag loss of both kinds of tags. And for model selection, we used the archaic case information criterion, also known as AIC, and it is the most common model selection parameter that's used in these kinds of studies. So I'm not going to talk about it a lot. And let's start with the results. Hope I made myself understandable. Wait a second, let's just drink a little of water. Hope I made myself understandable doing these methods, but if somebody is interested in it, they can write me an email or ask me questions after the presentation. So there's quite a lot of graphs here in the results. So let's go graph by graph. This is our first estimate, which is the estimate of the reciting probability, which, as I said, is a good proxy of the sampling effort. And as you can see, we estimated it for both kinds of tags. And plastic rings are more easy to observe every year than the metal rings. This is quite obvious, right? The plastic rings have the codes very clear to observe, and the metal rings are quite tricky to read. So that was expectable. But the important thing in this graph was to see that in most years of the study, the recite probability was above 0.9. This is quite rare and it's quite difficult to find in other mark recapture studies, in which normally reciting probability is below 0.5. But here, having it above 0.9 means that the sampling effort was huge on many years. And also, we also estimated this recovery probability, which again is the probability of finding a dead individual in the field, which was estimated at 34%. Even if you can think that perhaps it's not that high probability, it needs a huge sampling effort to get to this 34%. Because imagine that when an individual dies, for example, it can be easily predated or scavenged by animals that eat dead animals, for example, I don't know, ravens or feral dogs that eat dead vultures easily when they find them. And also there's another possibility. For example, they might fall into the sea, so we cannot find them anymore, or they might be degraded before we find them. So 34% is quite a lot. Let's move to the tag loss probabilities, actually. This is a very interesting result. So in the y-axis, you have the ring loss probability of either ring. In the x-axis, this is the number of years since ringing. So we told the model to expect that the more years the ring has been used, the higher the probability is to lose the ring. And the models told us that probably that was true. The thick lines show us the yearly probability of losing the tag is increasing. Not that much, but increasing. But the worrying, let's say worrying, estimate here is the triangle line, which is the cumulative ring loss probability, which increases quite a lot, right? And after 15 years of use of the rings, it shows that both rings have 50% of each ring might be lost already. That's quite a lot. And this shows us that accounting for tag loss is essential to obtain realistic survival estimates. I actually think that if we didn't account for survival, 50% of the tags would have been lost after 15 years. So we might assume that 50% of our population or of our population that had reached 15 years old is dead when it's not. It just lose the tags. So yeah, it's very important to account for tag loss, and I'd say that not many studies in the world of mark-recapture account for it. So this result, I think, is a warning signal for all the studies to account for tag loss. Let's move to the main result, finally, of this seminar and of this study, which is survival probability. So the main question is, did the conservation measures work or didn't they work? You can check it in this graph, actually. You have these different age classes, juveniles, adults, and adults. And the results are organized by the survival estimate that we obtained before the implementation of the life measures and after the implementation of the life measures. And as you can see, there is an increase in survival after the implementation of these measures. Especially, it is more high in survivors and adults, but the increase is important, and it is probably showing us that the conservation measures were actually effective. If you remember what I said a few slides ago, I said that for a population to be self-sustainable, adult survival should be over 90% or 0.9. As you see, before the implementation of the life measures, it was sort of around 90% or maybe a little below. Of course, when the population was only 21 breeding pairs, this adult survival was not super cool to have. We would like a better adult survival to have a recovery and for the population to improve. And actually, after the implementation of these measures, it went steadily above 90%. So yeah, this is in agreement actually to the population censuses that have been done in the island for the last 22 years, in which they show that the population has more than tripled, which is excellent news. And actually, it makes us be optimistic about the future. Yes, so let's go for the second aim of the project. Did we effectively mitigate the mortality causes? And the answer is, at least for poisoning, probably yes. Let's analyze the data, because we have in the left the mortality by age classes before the implementation of the LIFE project, and on the right we have the mortality by age classes after the implementation of LIFE project. In this case, mortality is shown by the number of dead individuals reported. And that's an interesting thing to see here. The first is that poisoning mortality was mainly concentrated on adults. And as I said, this was quite expectable, right? Because adults live basically in territories. They don't go that often to this supplementary feeding station where poison-free food is delivered to them, but they rather go to food that is within their territories. And if this food comes from farms, they might be very exposed to this poisoning. So yeah, we sort of expected this. But the very good news here is that after the implementation of the life measures, the number of poisoning events dramatically declined, and there was just 2 adults and 1 sub-adult death after 2007, which is a very, very low rate. Amazing news. And also, if you remember that we said that adult survival is very important in these species, probably the decline in poisoning is one of the main explanations for the recovery of this formerly critically endangered bird. But there's even a more important thing to remember here, which is that the one and only measure that was implemented to improve or to mitigate the poisoning mortality was awareness and education campaigns. So we basically focused on stakeholders, farmers, and schools and media presence to explain the problematics of poisoning. And apparently this has worked out, which is the first probably evidence that education campaigns can have a positive impact on a population, on an endangered population on the short term with quantitative data. So I'd say this is quite a very interesting result. And we could open many hypotheses of why these awareness education campaigns worked that well. This is just hypothesis, because if we want to answer these questions, we should have more scientific studies. But here in the island of Fuerteventura, one thing that we have to consider is that the Canarian Egyptian vulture, also called girre in these islands, it has a very good reputation, right? It's not what you would expect of a vulture in many European societies, but in this case, they have a very good reputation. And for example, the pre-Hispanic cultures in the Canary Islands, which were called Vouchers, they already thought that this bird was sacred, and they had a very good treatment to the bird. And the present culture, that they still think it's a very good bird, and they don't think it's an evil bird like in many European cultures or societies might think about vultures, basically. So it's actually a flagship species with good reputation. When it's a flagship species that everybody loves, it is quite easy, perhaps, to go tell people, look, the species is disappearing, basically, because of poisoning. You should stop poisoning because vultures eat the poison and they just die. Perhaps it is much easier for people to stop doing it if the species has a good reputation, right? That might have influenced a lot in our results. But also, perhaps, another thing that influenced our results is that we are talking about Fuerteventura and Lanzarote, but especially Fuerteventura. These are small societies with some few dozens of thousands of people living there. So perhaps small island societies are easier to permeate by this conservation message. We don't know this. We are just hypothesizing, but definitely future science might try, and that would be a very good news to start to answer this hypothesis. The other main cause of death here was power lines, and we had these collisions and entanglements in these power lines. What our data suggests is that there has been an effective mitigation, because after the implementation of the live measures, we have reported no more death cases in the power lines. See again the distribution of the death events. They were mostly concentrated of sub-adults. Why? Well, as I said, the older you get, the better skills you have. So we don't see adults with a lot of mortality in power lines. Sub-adults, they still don't have maybe the flying skills 100% developed, but also what sub-adults do is do long dispersal trips to prospect for future territories in which they might stabilize and start breeding. So they make very, very long trips in which they are very exposed to this kind of mortality. So this huge frequency of dead individuals in sub-adult does not surprise us, actually. But the good news, you see these stabilizers here in the picture on the right, and they are much wider than before. So there is no way now that the birds can get trapped by their legs. So that's logical that we find no mortality, that they have worked so effectively. So this means that complete work has been done. All lines in the island have been modified, and the good news are here: no more mortality in these infrastructures. At least no more detected mortality. There is, however, a new challenge, which is electrocution mortality. You see here that electrocution was quite uncommon before the implementation of the life measures, but it is now quite more common. There's been 13 events of mortality after the implementation of these life measures. For you to understand how these birds can get electrocuted, you see in this picture on the right the individual flying and trying to land in a power pole. For example, if they land in this cable that's above, and the cable that has the electrical tension, it's a little bit hard to explain now because I'm not there, but it's this curved cable that is on the top. This is the one that has the electricity. So if the bird lands on a place and with the wing they contact this cable, the bird acts as a bridge of electricity between the cable and the power infrastructure, and they basically get fried and die instantly. And this is a bad way to die, but it is what it is. And why is electrocution mortality increasing? Well, we don't know, but probably the most, let's say, reasonable explanation is that before there were, for example, these birds, as I said, they use a lot the power poles, right? So before maybe there were like 3 or 4 individuals per pole. Now perhaps there are 15, 16, 17, so that they disturb each other. There's more movement. They land next to the other one. They for example, they disturb the individual that's next to them, and the individuals fly more, and there is more movement. So it's easier to commit a mistake, to touch this cable with the wing, and to die. And that's basically the main explanation. But luckily, in 2019, there was some funding to start changing these power infrastructure so that electrocution could not happen anymore and poles would be electrocution safe. So probably in the next years we're going to start to see that electrocution mortality also decreases. So I don't know if I'm on time or not. I'll go quickly to the conclusions of the study. Very quickly. One thing that this is probably a weak point of the study is that we didn't have so many mortality events reported, so that we could. This is probably this is perfectly possible when you have lots of mortality events reported. You can add mortality events by different causes to the you will get estimates of mortality by different causes and changes in mortality by different causes with estimates that are not that biased, and this is a much better way of analyzing it than just reporting cases. That was what we did, right? But our sample size of dead cases was too low to assess it statistically. But because we had more or less the same sampling effort throughout the course of the study, we might think that the data is representative, and actually the measures have had a positive effect on the population, and actually our survival increases confirmed this, so we are quite safe that this worked out. Also, as I said before, our study provides this evidence to wildlife conservation, so that these measures and these specific changes in power lines and these specific strategies to avoid poisoning are now checked and they work, so that probably managers can use them in similar scenarios and they can expect them to work, perhaps. So this evidence is also important. And also there's all these questions about the effectiveness of the environmental education and awareness campaigns, right? As we said, does the island and the small society have something to do with the effectiveness of these awareness campaigns? Is it exportable to other similar environments? Does the good reputation of the species have something to do? Probably yes. But these are, as I said, questions that we should aim to answer in new in further studies. Very briefly, there's another conclusion that is the last one already. That our long-term monitoring program has allowed us to do this study. The study confirms that the conservation measures work and they are effective. But our long-term monitoring for 22 years, quite intense, has provided other interesting knowledge about the biology of the species, and this is important also to put this into value. For example, we now know more things of the biology and behavior of the species. We know that maybe you are familiarized with the fact that the other vultures, for example, the bearded vulture, you might know it in Catalan as trencalos, in Spanish as quebrantahuesos. They use makeup actually in iron waters to colorize their plumage and to be more attractive to partners. And we just the guys there in the field that just discovered that the Egyptian vultures in the Canary Islands were doing basically the same. When they find sands with iron, not water, because there's not many water in the island, they would use makeup, and with this makeup, they are probably being more attractive to the sexual partners. If you are interested in why, just ask me afterwards, after we finish the presentation. And there's also many other things that have been known about the sexual behavior of the species, because lots of people think, for example, that these birds and vultures are monogamous. We have this nice story that people used to love so much, that vultures just have a partner throughout their lives, and they are 100%. They have 100% fidelity to them, and it is true. But what field biologists observed in the field is that it is probably closer to the way of having relationships that humans have than to this ideal of 100% monogamous relationships. So they found that that personality is a thing to consider in birds, and especially in vultures. So there were individuals that were, for example, 100% fidel to their partner for their whole lives. There were individuals that loved being infidels, and they had so many infidelities throughout their lives. There were also individuals that were, for example, aged 25 or 30 years old and had been single for their whole lives, and the strategy was, for example, to get to the supplementary feeding station early in the morning, where many vultures gather at some point of the day, and try to have some extra matrimonial relationships, let's say like that. And it was their common strategy, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But they, for example, just started having chicks without any parental care. So it is also another strategy that's possible, and it's possible to see in this species. So, as I said, we also saw events of jealousy. So, for example, an individual changed pairs, and the former pair of the individual was jealous to the new pair. It's very complex. And this monitoring is also showing us insights of this. So long-term monitoring, as I said, it doesn't only provide information for a paper. It also provides very interesting and valuable information about the biology and behavior of species. So to build up evidence-based conservation, we need this long-term monitoring, but to many other things, we also need it. So it is very important. And I hope you found the concept, the presentation interesting. It's coming to an end. I'll be happy to accept questions. I'd like to be grateful to the colleagues in the field from this IMEDEA Research Center in the Balearic Islands and the Nyana Biological Station, which are basically the institutions that are analyzing the data and working in the field, to the University of Lund, which allowed me to do a master's for free. That's thanks to the people that pay their taxes in the country and allow people that come from other countries to do masters for free. Thank you very much. Masters are much more expensive in Spain, unfortunately. And also to the University of Barcelona, to which I'm doing the PhD right now, but they are very grateful, and they are very supportive whenever I have a problem. And they are also, helping me with everything. So thank you very much. I will be glad to hear questions. And as I said, I hope the presentation was interesting for you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jaume. It was so it is a very interesting topic. Are there any questions? I have a question concerning I think what you call recite probability.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that in your slide in 2003 or 2005 there was a very low recite probability. So, do you know what's the reason why in some years?
Yes. Let me. What? It wasn't over there.
I think it was the first.
Yes, here.
Yes, this one. Yes.
I think there should be a reasonable explanation, right? But if you put this into context, the monitoring program has lasted for many years, and when I got there, started analyzing the data, and we found these results. The first thing we did was to call these guys and ask them why this happened. Unfortunately, in 20 years, there's been many different field biologists working in the field, and so even if we contacted the guys to ask them what happened in 2003 and in 2005, they didn't have an explanation. They said, "Oh, we tried to read as many as possible in these years, and we are quite surprised that the results are these results." So there is not actually a logical explanation. Probably that they were unlucky, maybe, or there were maybe some unexperienced field biologists that did not find all the birds they had to find. But yeah, there is no, let's say, there is no safe explanation for that.
the number of observations were the same, I guess, right? So it's not a methodological question, a problem, I mean.
No, it's not a methodological problem. However, it is important to consider this because this is the data, and the data shows that there was a lower sampling effort in 2003 and in 2005. So actually, the mark-recapture method is correcting by this low sampling effort, but it was super important to quantify this. So yes, luckily with this method, we were able to assess this, and also in many studies, for example, when you try to estimate this recite probability, you can only get a general recite probability for all years, which is constant. But luckily, because the sampling effort was so huge, we could estimate it for every year, and this is how we can detect, for example, these low reductions in sampling effort in specific years.
And another question. So, do you know the reason why they lose the plastic or the metal ring? So, do they actively remove it, or it's just by accident? Or?
I would not like to say anything wrong, but I sort of remember that we discussed this quite a lot with the people there in the island, and I said that they haven't observed individuals removing the plastic ring so far. So probably the main answers for that are that basically throughout the years the plastic ring can get broken very easily, because in the end it's plastic, and it can be degraded very easily. You can also think that in Fuerteventura there's a lot of wind, then there's a lot of sand because it's a desert basically. So sand would, for example, day by day keep impacting in the rings. So you end up having a ring that is broken, or maybe a ring where the alphanumeric code is so degraded that you cannot read it anymore. That's the main reason.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, thanks to you.
More questions? There's a question in the chat. Can you read it?
Yeah, of course. Alex Lopez, friend of mine, by the way. We did the bachelor's degree together. He's studying here in the University of Girona, the PhD. He says, you said in the introduction that the vultures are important for the economy. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? Yes, of course. When people ask me about that, I always explain the same case, because it's a very didactic case. Let's see. Let's go here to the slide. There was a study in the Indian peninsula, in the Indian subcontinent, basically in the countries of India and Nepal, in which they detected decline in vultures in the area. It was actually one of the quickest declines ever reported in birds. It was because of poisoning. There was a poison that was called diclofenac, that was basically a medicine used in cattle, so that in cattle individuals would be implemented this diclofenac, which is a sort of anti-steroid, anti-inflammatory. And when these individuals died, vultures would eat these cattle and they would die massively. And that was the main reason that explained that vultures in the Indian subcontinent went from some few millions to some few hundreds in just 6 or 7 years. That was a massive decline, actually. And there was a study from the University of the Basque Country, actually, that tried to see what was the effect on the economy of that decline. And it was quite important, basically because when you see what vultures do in the ecosystem, when an animal dies, they basically eat them very quickly and very efficiently. When you see, for example, a carcass of a dead cow or a dead goat that has been eaten by a vulture, you can only see the bones. There's almost no flesh there. So when the flesh is exposed to the environment for many days, let's say, it gets rotten, and there's, for example, lots of bacteria that start spreading. And for example, if the individual is dead close to a river or to a stream or close to a city, there's many dangerous bacteria that can spread. For example, anthrax. I guess you know anthrax, but it's basically mortal. If a human enters in contact with extract with their nose, there's no way to save them. They will just die. And there's other, for example, bacteria that are also widespread in flies like rabies. So, for example, when an animal carcass is there and there's no vultures, the animals that will probably feed on the carcass are, for example, feral dogs, which are really a problem in India, but they are also a problem here. And these feral dogs might feed on the carcass, and they might eat these rabies, and they might get these rabies. And if they bite a human, for example, they would spread the rabies to humans. So in the end, these guys from the University of the Basque Country started studying which was the costs for public health system in India, for example, because the rabies had a spread after vultures disappeared, and anthrax cases also increased, and they reached that the economic costs of this disappearance were about 13,000 million euros, which is quite a lot for a country like India. And we have also experienced here in the Iberian Peninsula or in Spain, for example, when there was this problem with the mad cows, in which they had to sacrifice that many cows because of this disease that started killing people. So what they would say to control the spread of this disease, okay, farmers in Spain cannot leave the dead cows in the field anymore. They just have to bring them to incinerary, to burning chambers, to burn the corpses of the cows, which is basically paying for the elimination of the cows, but not having vultures that were doing it for free for the last years. And the cost for farmers was estimated at 50 million euros per year, which is also quite a lot. And that's why I said that the disappearance of vultures can have an implication on human health, but also on human economy. That was the point.
More questions? Is there any question? No? Okay, so then if there are no more questions, thank you very much, Jaume, for your talk, and I hope that it has been interesting for everyone.